It's a good crowd. Good afternoon. Ambassador Gray, President Cabrera, Justice Thomas, Judges Sintel and Ginsburg, Professor Muris, distinguished guests, friends of Scalia Law, faculty, staff, and most importantly, our awesome students. Thank you for joining us in this celebration of the naming of the C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. Please stand for the national anthem, which will be sung by Mason student Joy Harper.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Joy. That was beautiful. Well, some of my students may know that I have a penchant for audience participation. So be ready to participate. You ready? Okay. Give me a B. B. Give me an O. O. Give me a Y. Y. Give me a D. D. Give me an N. N. What's that spell? Boyden. What's that spell? Boyden. What's that spell? Boyden. All right. All right, let's get on with the show now. Angel Cabrera is the 6th president of George Mason University. Born in Madrid, President Cabrera is the first native of Spain to lead an American university, which prompts me to mention that I am the first native Virginian to serve as Dean of Scalia Law. Prior to becoming president of Mason in 2012, Dr. Cabrera served as president of the Thunderbird School of Global Management in Arizona and as dean of the IE Business School in Madrid. President Cabrera earned his BS and his MS from the Polytechnic University of Madrid and his MS and PhD from Georgia Tech, which he attended as a Fulbright scholar. President Cabrera is a strong supporter of Scalia Law. He has been a great president for us, and I'm delighted that he is with us today. Please give a rousing welcome to President Cabrera.
I don't know where Dean Butler gets his energy from, but I want to have for breakfast whatever it is you're having. And by the way, you're not just the first Virginian to be the dean of the Scalia Law School, you're the only native of anywhere to be the dean of the Scalia Law School. As I remember, you named it. So anyways, actually, no, let me start by congratulating that man who just introduced me, Dean Henry Butler, because he said he was going to, put all of his heart and soul in this school, and he was going to make a difference. And boy, has he delivered. And I'll tell you, there is a before and after Henry Butler in the law school. And on behalf of the rest of the university, Henry, and I know this last year has not been easy for you, and your energy is at the highest it's ever been. Thank you. Thank you. By the way, our law school is currently ranked 29, not in the United States, but in the world, according to global rankings. Think about it. There are hundreds of schools just in the U.S. Yeah, feel free to applaud. That's a pretty big one, yeah. We're very proud of that. And one of the reasons that the law school, a very young law school, has been able to carve its position in a very competitive marketplace of ideas and schools was by doing a couple of things. One, of course, by focusing on high caliber faculty. My colleagues in the faculty of the law school are just absolutely first rate. But the other one was by being smart and focusing on things that matter a great deal and that not many people were doing right. One of those things, for example, the field of law and economics, and how do you bring those disciplines to analyze very complex problems. And it is, by the way, that excellence in the field of law and economics that is going to be really the underpinning of the new center, of how to not just look at regulation, administrative state from the standpoint of constitutional law or administrative structure, but very importantly, by understanding the economic causes and effects of what regulation means. So there's nothing accidental about the success of the Scalia Law School. It's all based on pretty smart strategic decisions that predate some of us, but that we're hopefully going to keep pushing forward. Ambassador Gray, it's a true honor to have the center named after you, and truly not just have your gift, but your name. That's sort of that's a double gift. This is not a subject that you just happen to appreciate. This is a subject where you have led. This subject where you've been a pioneer. You've been part of some of the very earliest efforts at the highest level of government in this country. Even earlier in the green room, it was just fascinating connecting some of the dots between you and Justice Thomas, and now the highest official in the White House working in this space, Professor Naomi Rao, who of course is on leave of absence. We're still waiting for you to come back, Naomi. So this is just the perfect school to do this kind of work. We have just the absolutely perfect faculty and talent to do it in the perfect location. Now we have the perfect name to put on that work, and for that I'm really grateful, and we're honored. So very proud of the law school, very proud of what we're achieving. Looking forward to the great work that we're going to do under this name. And thank you, thanks to all of you for being here. And by the way, and we have members of our foundation board. Jay, thank you so much for representing chairman of our foundation board here. We have members of our board of visitors. Thank you so much, Lisa, for being part of this. I don't know if I'm missing a lot of people, but thank you all for being here. And in particular, of course, Justice Thomas, it's always just an honor to have you. I know every time there is an important, not just an important party in this place, we know we can count on you. So for that, I am also very, very grateful. And I think with that, if I understand this correctly, Dean Butler is carefully coming back onto stage to continue to the program. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you, President Cabrera. You don't get the give me a C. I was thinking about giving a C and then going C Boyden Gray, just to tease you a little bit. But I didn't go there. The man of the hour, we're not messing with them, okay? Boyden, I would like to echo all of the President's remarks about this double whammy. Having your name and some of your treasure is really a wonderful thing for our law school. And, this is not an accident. Boyden has been actively engaged in the school and programs before we actually started our Center for the Study of the Administrative State. And when I first became dean, I went and I called on Boyden and I wanted to talk to him about two things. One was, why the hell are you teaching at NYU? And he said he didn't know, so he's now at George Mason. we still haven't had our salary negotiations. So, I shouldn't have said that. And then I wanted to talk to him about the idea that we discussed a little bit in passing, that Naomi and I had discussed in great detail, and that was the formation of the Center for the Study of the Administrative State. And I really wanted to get his blessing and his insights for what we were doing, and I got a lot of suggestions about what to do and how to move forward with that. And we launched the center really my first semester as dean, and it's been an incredible success for us at an important, pivotal time in administrative law in this country. So we're really great to be, really thrilled to be such an important part of major national debates. Now, when Naomi left us to save the world, we didn't have to look far to find someone to take her place. Adam Smith, I love that.
Yeah, you would have had to look pretty far for him.
That's exactly right. All right, you know, I'm allowed 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 screw-ups per talk. Adam had already done a lot of work with us. He'd helped Naomi organize a couple of research programs and conferences, and so it was a natural to call on him. He is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. We figured out a deal where we could take away some of his time from there, in theory, anyway. I think he's working a lot of hours these days. He's already been an adjunct professor here, so now he's assistant professor of law and executive director of the C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. He is a proud graduate of the University of Iowa, an obnoxious Iowa Hawkeye, and a graduate of Harvard Law School. He clerked for Judge David Sentell. This is starting to feel like a family reunion up here. He previously practiced law with Boyden Gray and Associates. And one time I was discussing with Adam what it was like to work with Boyden. He said, well, there are lots of ideas thrown around and a lot of things going on all the time. It's very exciting. And then things moved on a little bit. He said, you know, once you work for once you work for Boyden, you never stop working for Boyden. You get these random phone calls. You know, I've got this idea. I'd like for you to take a look at it. And he's not the only former Boyden Gray associate who gets those types of calls. So when I called Adam to inform them that Boyden had agreed to give a naming gift to the Center for the Study of the Administrative State, he went, oh my, I'm working for Boyden again. I really am working for Boyden. Please welcome Adam White.
You know, it's funny about the introduction. Anytime I'm introduced for the center, there's always a 50-50 chance I'm misintroduced. Not because of the Adam Smith thing, although that happens quite a lot. But there's about a 50-50 chance anytime I give a talk that somebody will introduce me as leading the Center for the Administrative State. And I have to explain, no, that's every other law school in Washington, D.C. I run the center that studies the administrative state. But you know, 3 years ago, when Dean Butler and Naomi founded the center, they chose a pretty straightforward name for a pretty straightforward reason. In the courts and in Congress, we were seeing new questions arising over and over again about the modern administrative state. We're seeing new questions arise for the first time, and we're also seeing old questions that we thought were long settled being raised once again. And we thought, or the Dean Butler and Naomi thought, that these questions deserved serious study and spirited debate. And then much of what we'd seen already was fueled by recent scholarship written by professors scattered across the country. And Dean Butler and Professor Rao thought that this center should be established to serve as an institutional home right here in the Washington area for these great debates, a place where we could convene scholarly discussions and public policy conferences and aim towards fostering serious scholarship that could help inform and elevate the debates happening in the courts and in Congress. And all this, they strove to build a bridge, bringing ideas from legal academia to the legal and policy debates occurring across the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Now, in our first years, we've organized conferences and produced papers on issues ranging from due process and judicial deference to the intersection of administrative law with other areas of law, like free speech or religious liberty. and we've raised other significant emerging issues. The Senate has already hosted 2 of our public policy conferences on Capitol Hill. And beginning this year, I'm very proud to say, an issue of the George Mason Law Review will be dedicated to a symposium on administrative law in conjunction with our center. We're going to start in the fall with a symposium on agency adjudication, an issue that Justice Thomas is hearing quite a lot about these days. That begins this fall. Now, all of this, everything that's happening at the center right now, reflects first and foremost the vision and efforts of our friend and colleague, Professor Rao, who founded the center 3 years ago, before the president appointed her to her new serious job as administrator of, well, she founded the center to study the administrative state. Now she finds herself in the middle of the administrative state as administrator for the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Naomi, we're so glad you could join us today. My next line was, I hope you'll join me in welcoming and thanking Professor Rao, but you beat me to the punch. Frankly, I'm so honored to get to continue the work that Naomi started here at the center, and now I'm doubly honored to get to do it under the name of my friend and mentor, C. Boyden Gray. As President Cabrera and Dean Butler have said, we're all so grateful, Boyden, for your support and encouragement. And I think all of us here today would agree there's no one who's done more than you to promote the constitutional rule of law and a commitment to rigorous policy analysis in the modern regulatory process, beginning with your service co-chairing President Reagan's Task Force on Regulatory Relief, which established the modern framework for White House regulatory oversight. Naomi, thanks you for creating a job for her. Since then, Boyden has served as White House counsel, as U.S. ambassador to the European Union, and in countless other ways, contributing immense effort to promoting the rule of law and regulatory reform. Now, to celebrate our rededication of the center in Boyden's name, we are fortunate to be joined by all of you and also by the distinguished speakers here on stage, each of whom knows Boyden well and fondly. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the first of them now. Douglas H. Ginsburg is a senior judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, where he served as chief judge from 2001 to 2008. In 2013, he joined the Antonin Scalia Law School as a professor of law and chairman of our Global Antitrust Institute's International Advisory Board. Before his appointment to the D.C. Circuit in 1986, he served as the Justice Department Antitrust Division's Assistant Attorney General. He was a professor of law at Harvard Law School. And from 1984 to 1985, he served as administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Judge Ginsburg, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Adam, not Smith. Be careful, Justice Thomas promised to give us his lecture on the Dormant Commerce Clause as soon as he gets a chance. That's what he said. During his time in the Reagan administration, Boyden served, as to which Adam alluded, as counsel to the Presidential Task Force on regulatory relief. And in 1981, he actually wrote the executive order 12291 that regularized White House review of proposed and final regulations and subjected major regulations to a cost-benefit analytic requirement. In order to have some confidence that major regulations actually served rather than just burdened the public. The executive order was, I think, expected and intended to diminish the growth of to diminish the regulatory state as a whole, not just the growth of it. But I'm sorry to say that Boyden's efforts, and mine as I held that office that you created, haven't turned out quite as optimistically as we had hoped. So taking a rough but sufficient measure of regulatory activity, let's look at the Code of Federal Regulations for a moment. In 1980, when Boyden came to the White House just that previous year, the code was slightly over 100,000 pages. When the previous administration left in 2016, it was over 180,000 pages, an 80% increase in that period. If we look at the number of new regulations as another proxy, the picture is just as urgent. In 2016, calendar year 2016, Congress enacted 214 laws. the regulatory state produced 3,853 new rules and regulations, exactly 18 times plus one more than the number of laws passed by the Congress. So if you wonder who governs you, it's not your elected representatives in any direct sense. In terms of major rules, those with that $100 million or more burden that are subject to cost-benefit analysis, the Reagan administration averaged about 25 of those per year that got through final review and were issued. In the most previous administration, the Obama administration, that number was an average of 55, and it spiked in 2016 to 95 major new regulations. Since Boyden's time in the White House and mine, the Congress has created two major new regulatory agencies. The Transportation Safety Administration, which of course emerged after September 11 and has become familiar to the traveling public as the personification of incompetent bureaucracy. The other, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and it does run a protection scheme, has the unprecedented distinction of getting its funding from the Federal Reserve System instead of the Congress. So it has no need to rely on congressional appropriations, and as the Congress has recently discovered, no need to attend oversight hearings either. For the Congress to create an agency over which it didn't have the power of the purse is, I think, one of the great mysteries of recent time. There's no doubt that this growth in the administrative state has been a drag on the economy. One nonpartisan study estimated that the public's cost of complying with federal rules and regulations totaled $1.9 trillion in 2016. In that year, and that was all off budget. That's what you and I and companies spend to comply. The on-budget federal spending was $3.8 trillion, all considered, okay? Not just for regulation, but for everything. So regulatory compliance added 50% to the burden imposed on the public by the federal budget, and it's all off budget. It's almost invisible. Now, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge that the courts have contributed in their own way to this expansion. In 1984, some of Justice Thomas's predecessors decided the, I'll call it notorious Chevron case, holding that the courts have to ordinarily defer to an agency's own interpretation of the statute that it administers. And since then, the court's gone on and told us we have to defer as well to the agency's interpretations of the regulations that they've issued. That was our case. And then most recently in City of Arlington, that we have to defer to the agency's interpretation of their own jurisdiction, something against which I warned in a footnote about 25 years ago that apparently didn't circulate to the Supreme Court. So these decisions, these three in particular, have permitted and might even have encouraged agencies to regulate as broadly and frequently as possible, largely free of adult supervision by the courts. Neither the causes nor the implications of this recent growth in the administrative state, I think, neither are fully understood. But for the last couple of years, they've been the subject of sustained cross-disciplinary research here at the Center for the Study of the Administrative State. And now, owing to Boyden's determination to see this project reach its full potential, we are here to celebrate the newly christened C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. Thanks to the efforts of President Trump and our colleague Naomi Rao as his regulatory czarina, we have reason to think it's not too late for scholarship and informed debate to influence the direction of the administrative state, perhaps even to disrupt the seemingly automatic process by which the perception of a problem, be it ever so modest, is the occasion for a new regulation, if not a whole new agency, with all its cost and potential for bureaucratic abuse of the public. That's our hope. Boyden, you've rekindled it. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Well, our next speaker, I think, may have known Boyden longer than anybody else here today. David B. Santel is a senior judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, where he served as chief judge from 2008 to 2013. Before President Reagan appointed him to the D.C. Circuit, he appointed him to be a district judge for the U.S. District Court for the Western District of North Carolina in his hometown of Asheville. But before his time on the federal bench and on the state bench and in private practice, Judge Santel graduated from the University of North Carolina Law School, where he edited the Law Review with his fellow Tar Heel, Boyden Gray. Judge?
Let me make it very clear. When Adam says I edited the Law Review with Boyden Gray, I worked for Boyden Gray like everybody else. Boyden was editor-in-chief. He appointed me as his research editor, and I worked for Boyden like everybody else here. And as somebody said, you don't ever get through working for Boyden. When he was White House counsel, he called me one day to have lunch. And I found out after a little while that the hour-and-a-half lunch had been to pick my brain about somebody they were thinking about appointing to the Supreme Court. Clarence, I dare say you wished we didn't have that lunch a few times. But in any event, I remember Boyden Gray when we were 1Ls. Now, I realize that some of the younger people here think you can't remember anything that long. But I assure you that no one has forgotten C. Boyden Gray, CB as we said in those days. Nobody's ever forgotten CB. He was number one in our class in 3 respects. He had the best grades. The grades were transparent in those days. Boyden was number 1 in grades. He was the tallest. And I'm sure he was the richest person in Chapel Hill. Now, all of those things have relevance today. Beyond the obvious, even. But Boyden didn't become the number 1 student in the class just because of his innate brilliance, which was a factor, but also because he was about the most studious person you would ever know. Before he became editor-in-chief and had his own office, he was such a regular at the Laurel Library, which we had to go to the library in those days. You didn't have computers. We had to actually go there. And Boyden was so regular that we actually, when we took prospective students on tour, we pointed him out in the lower reading room as a feature of the reading room. Here's the old books collection, here's Boyden Gray, here's the library. But he did it with a great deal of effort not because of the same reason some of the rest of us may have, that while we loved the law, and we did love the studying, and I don't mean that facetiously, nonetheless, we also were always thinking about the fact we had to get a job someday. He never had to get a job. And yet, he was as studious and as hardworking as anybody you have ever seen. He ran a Law Review that was 2 issues behind in time when he took it over, and I think we came out on time with the 4th edition of our number, which was actually the 6th that Boyden had produced because of having taken over 1, 2 behind. And he did all these things while the rest of us may have had our weekends to catch up in. CB was off on his volunteer duty as a Marine reservist, where he rose to the rank of sergeant. And I would say, CB, that, you know, the late Chief Justice Rehnquist has on his tombstone, William Hubbs Rehnquist, Sergeant, United States Air Force, Chief Justice of the United States. Being a sergeant is a very important thing for somebody that wants to serve his country in the way that Boyden has. So those features of his academic excellence, when you couple it with the work that produced it, have marked Boyden out the rest of his life. Here was a man who didn't never have to look for a job. He became a clerk of the Supreme Court just right out of law school. He had the family behind him that he knew that he never would have to wonder how he was going to feed children or get a new suit when it was needed. And yet he's worked as hard as anybody you've ever known. And at 75 years old, he's still out there working. Now, I say he's old, but Boyden is actually older than me, you understand? He was born on Ronald Reagan's birthday, the 6th of February. I waited around for Lincoln's birthday on the 12th of February. He's got me by 6 days. So I would say that his academic excellence and his financial prominence continue unto this day, so that we learned in law school what this person was. And I said all of these had some relevance. I've had a hard time figuring out how to tie in his height. There's one thing you can rely on from Boyden Gray, though. If he recommends a hotel to you, it will not have one of those low shower heads that so much stuff. So Boyden, in the end, I want to say to you that I want to thank you for the years of friendship. I want to thank you for the leadership you gave us on a law review that we took over 2 issues behind. I want to thank you most of all for what you've done for this country. Just as you served this country voluntarily as an enlisted Marine, you've taken on another danger to this country when you wrestled with the behemoth or leviathan or whichever it is of federal regulatory law for these last many years. It should be a proud day, and it is, for this institution to have your name put over there. Now, somebody said it was a perfect name, and in a way it is. You know, Gray's a pretty short name. You don't need to buy many letters to put up there, but you don't have to put Cleland up there, it'd be really long. Cleland Boyden Gray would be, but C. Boyden Gray is, that fits pretty nicely over any door you're going to have. And it should be a moment of pride for anybody that comes through that door to know that you were on the trail. You set this out to have the, not battle against, but the battle to contain and to manage that wild beast that has become the federal regulatory state. So thank you, Boyden, for all you did.
So our next speaker regrets not being able to attend in person, but when we asked, he was very eager to record a message for this occasion. Senator Rob Portman was elected to the Senate from the state of Ohio in 2010. Today he serves on the Senate's Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, which has jurisdiction over administrative law and regulatory reform issues. He chairs its permanent subcommittee on investigations. And before coming to the Senate, he directed the White House's Office of Management and Budget. He was the U.S. Trade Representative, and he was a member of Congress. Before all that, his public service career began in 1989 in the White House of President George H.W. Bush, where he served as an associate counsel under White House counsel C. Boyden Gray. And so, Lee, if you will, please start the tape.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. Today we're celebrating the career and achievements of my good friend and my former boss, Boyden Gray. I really wish I could be with you there in person. I'm here on Capitol Hill voting, because I'd like to tell you some stories, some of which Boyden would want to hear and some he might not want to hear. But let me just say, as counsel to the Vice President of the United States during the Reagan administration and then White House counsel to President George H.W. Bush, there are few people more knowledgeable and more experienced in regulatory policy than Boyden. I rely on him constantly with our work on regulatory reform. Boyden did give me my first job in politics when he hired me on as associate counsel in the George H.W. Bush White House. To this day, I'm convinced that Boyden only hired me because he had all these bright Supreme Court clerks and needed one person who focused more on policy and knew less about law. And he's been a great friend and partner throughout my career in public service. Even today, again, I rely on his expertise and his insights, and they're very helpful. His ideas underpin the most significant pieces of regulatory reform legislation that Congress is now considering, by the way, including our legislation called the Regulatory Accountability Act. He's been a terrific advocate for bipartisan legislation like that, and the bill even codifies an executive order he wrote during his time in the Reagan administration. The C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State will be a hallmark of the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And it's such a well-deserved tribute for such a dedicated leader on these issues. Hope you enjoyed today's event, and Boyden, congratulations on this tremendous achievement. Godspeed.
Boyden, are you starting to feel the love? All right, our next speaker does not need any introduction, so I'm not going to give him one. I'm teasing. I couldn't resist that. Okay. All right. So I have to tell a story about my first experience watching the Clarence Thomas man in action. So my first stint at George Mason, I was running the Law and Economics Center in our judicial education program, and we had a conference for federal judges at Westward Look Resort in Tucson, Arizona. A great place. We had 24 federal judges there. It was a 2-week-long program, a lot of time in the classroom, great instructors from Paul Samuelson to Armin Alshin. It was quite a show, and I was like in awe the whole time since it was the first one of those that I had attended. I really didn't have anything to contribute to the program other than just kind of learning how it would be done. But I did take the opportunity to suggest to Dean Manny that we add a session on experimental economics, since Vernon Smith and his team was right there in Tucson at the University of Arizona. Now, Vernon was not able to participate, but he sent one of his proteges, Betsy Hoffman, to come over and do an auction with the judges. And the idea behind the auction is you take the 24 judges, you divide them in half. Some are designated as buyers, some are designated as sellers. They're given payoff sheets for how they can make money by what prices they sell at or what prices they supply the good at. And the sheets are different. And it's designed to it's an oral auction where you have the judges screaming out bids, and there's a professor at the front of the room who's writing down the bids. And the goal of this is to see how markets can work with incomplete information. What does it take to reach competitive equilibrium? And so the rules are set up, explained to the judges. We go through a practice round, and it's kind of chaotic, but people start to figure out how it's working. And then we're going to do 2 more rounds where there's real money at stake. That if you do well, you get cash. Not a lot, but there was a lot of pride on the line, and a little bit of trash talking between the buyers and the sellers about who was going to earn more money, because they thought at first that they were kind of cohesive and that the buyers were going to have one point of view and the sellers were going to have a different point of view. So the bidding starts, and we're about halfway through this first round, and it's getting chaotic, and judges are yelling and screaming. Not the buyers at the sellers, but the sellers at the sellers and the buyers at the buyers. And all of a sudden, Clarence stands up and says, "I've got the urge to collude!" We had to stop the clock, let people regain their composure, get the game back going. Needless to say, you failed in your role as a cartel manager. We received the market magic of a competitive equilibrium, which happened with incomplete information amongst the buyers and sellers, and that is what Vernon Smith won his Nobel Prize for. It's a real pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Clarence Thomas.
I've forgotten about that. Thank you, Dean Butler. I had totally forgotten about that. There's a lot I've forgotten about. David is absolutely right. Dean Butler and President Cabrera, and honored guests and friends, it truly is an honor to be here, and especially an honor to share the podium with such dear friends of mine from the D.C. Circuit, Doug Ginsburg and Dave Santel. Just as an aside, those were I was going to say those were great years. Those were some great months that I was on the D.C. Circuit. It didn't last that long, but these are 2 wonderful human beings, 2 brilliant colleagues. In reflecting on this occasion, 3 other people came to mind. Justice Scalia, who's a dear friend, Boyden Gray, and Naomi Rao. It is no small matter that this law school now bears Justice Scalia's name. He was second to none in his knowledge of and love for the law. And though he seemed to care about it all, both large and small matters, administrative law held a special place for him. In fact, he and I often talked about it. And Doug, we did talk about Arlington, city of Arlington, Chevron, and Auer. And I've told a story that we were on the bench one day, and I sat next to him in the later years, and he would lean back. And I'm sure people thought from time to time there was some esoteric conversation. Usually it was some quip that he had. And he leaned back one day and he said, "Clarence, Auer is the worst opinion in the history of the court." I said, "Nino, you wrote it." Well, sometimes we all write things that prompt us to start thinking. And I think that was one for him. Perhaps it was Justice Scalia's time at the administrative conference, his time at the Office of Legal Counsel, or the D.C. Circuit that spurred his interest in administrative law. Or more likely, it was his abiding interest in administrative law that, in some small way, caused him to spend so much time in those positions and give so much to those positions. The second person is Boyden Gray. I met Boyden Gray in the early and heady years of the Reagan administration. I was the new chairman of EEOC, and he was counsel to Vice President Bush and headed the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief. That was a major effort, as you've heard, to gain some control over the regulatory efforts throughout the federal government. I'm sure herding cats would have been easier. Certainly from my perspective, as the head of an agency, his task seemed enormous, if not Sisyphean. But none of us who labored on those regulations could come away untouched by that undertaking, and it was enormous. Over the years, I've come to realize that efforts such as that had the effect of prodding thoughtful, intelligent, and well-meaning individuals like Boyden to look more deeply into the underpinnings as well as the effects of administrative law. It certainly affects those of us who continue to live with it that way. Instead of flitting about with this or that reaction or emotional outburst, Boyden reflected more deeply about the relationship between the growth of the administrative state and a limited national government. And as today demonstrates beyond the least doubt, rather than throw his hands up in utter frustration, he has totally, and I mean totally, committed himself to furthering this understanding. And that brings me to Naomi Rao, who now serves as the head of the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, a product of Boyden's work on the Regulatory Task Force. Much about our relationship is fortuitous, and it is certainly fortuitous that she came to clerk for me. In any case, a few years ago, she asked what I thought of her starting a center that focused on the administrative state. Because administrative law is so ubiquitous, if not pervasive, I initially thought there might be no need and such an endeavor would, that no need for this, and such an endeavor would merely be redundant of so many other efforts. But she quickly pointed out that there was no such center in any other law school, so this would be a first. Like Boyden, she thought it critical to study and to understand the foundations of administrative law and provide the research that could inform changes within all three branches of our national government. She did not just want to focus on theories, as so many others have. Rather, she wanted to develop a place where scholarship and the real world of regulations could intersect, thus adding value to both. Last spring, I received a close-up view of her work and was again treated to her prodigious intellect and outstanding work ethic. We taught a seminar on the history of administrative law. What a joy that was, and a lot of work. I don't think I have the energy to do that again for a while. Today, these three people are fortuitously joined at this center. And should this center embody even a little of their character and abilities and their spirit, it will undoubtedly add much to our understanding of administrative law and its effects on our constitutional structure and order. Finally, as a point of privilege and at this delicate and difficult time in President Bush's life, I want to personally thank Boyden and through him, President Bush, for their confidence in me and for standing by my wife and me when so many others would have taken their leave. That is the kind of unfailing dedication and character of the man whose name now adorns this center. Congratulations to you all, and congratulations to you, and thank you, Boyden.
Thank you, Justice Thomas. Before we move into the final segment of the proceedings today, I do want to thank the people that made this event possible. In addition to all of our speakers, I want to thank Mark Forrest and Kristen Heller, Allison Price and Kim Gallagher, Kalina Thomas, the George Mason University Police and the Supreme Court Police, Senator Portman's staff, our team of student volunteers, the entire Founders Halls team, and of course the indefatigable Leah Verbitsky, who makes so much of this possible. So let's thank all of them, please. At this time, I'd like to invite up to the stage the Honorable Timothy J. Muris, the George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law and former Chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. His distinguished career in public service and academia have been marked by many significant responsibilities, but for today's purposes, I want to highlight one in particular. In 1981, he served as Vice President Bush's Deputy Counsel on the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief, which we've heard so much about today, where he worked with Boyden to craft the executive order and framework for the modern system of White House regulatory review. I can think of no one better suited to introduce our guest of honor today. So please, Tim.
Well, thank you very much. President Cabrera, Justice Thomas, Judges Ginsburg and Sintel, Dean Butler, Director Smith, friends of the university, friends of this law school, and of Ambassador Gray, and last, but first in our hearts today, Boyden. It's certainly a great personal honor for me to introduce Boyden. Of course, as you heard, I work for Boyden. Everybody works for Boyden. Just recently, Boyden called me with another assignment. Boyden has been a friend and a mentor, a colleague for almost 40 years. I'll just tick off some of the remarkable accomplishments in his career, which are enough for multiple lives. Magna cum laude graduate of Harvard. You heard top of his law school class, editor-in-chief of the Law Review, the Marine Corps stint, the law clerk for Chief Justice Warren, partner in a DC law firm. Now, all that was before he began his remarkable government service. 12 years as counsel to George H.W. Bush, ambassador to the European Union, special envoy for European affairs, as well as for Eurasian energy. In all of this, or with all of this, he became a world-class expert on and collector of the Republican city of Venice. It was in regulation that Boyden left his deepest mark. As you've heard, he was the counsel of the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief, which Vice President Bush was the head. Jim Miller and Boyden were the top staff. Frank Blake, who was later the CEO of Home Depot, and I had the honors of being deputy counsel. The American economy was in real trouble in 1981, and unnecessary regulation was a significant part of the problem. The executive order that Judge Ginsburg talked about was a necessary first step, and each subsequent president, no matter what the party, has adopted as his own a similar executive order with only minor modifications. In a famous incident in February 1981, the career general counsels, I think it was February 13th, but I'm not sure of the date, the career general counsels of the agencies were called to the White House to review this executive order. They pulled it out and they began to read it, and they started whacking away at it and crossing parts of it out until they got to the last page, and it had been signed by Ronald Reagan. Now, the task force was so successful that Democrats John Dingell and Al Gore, they hauled Boyden and Jim up to Capitol Hill for a public scolding. Now, during this hearing, during During this hearing, Mr. Gore went after Boyden with what he thought was the coup de grace. He thundered, he said, he had a problem, okay? Lots of corporations, I think it was a dozen or something, had met with Boyden and Jim and with some of us. And Gore thundered, "What gave them the right?" And Boyden responded. Boyden had this withering look, and he looked as if he'd been asked, what color was the sky? And Boyden replied, "The First Amendment right to petition the government." The Regulatory Relief Task Force produced immediate results, reducing regulatory burdens to levels not matched before or since, although the current administration has made a good, if inconsistent, start giving the threats on trade, which is no fault of Naomi's. The number of pages, we got rolled in 1981 on trade too, if you remember. The number of pages in the Federal Register declined an average of over 9% during President Reagan's first term. These are all good numbers, and so the numbers that Judge Ginsburg talked about came after. The budgets of regulatory agencies declined an average of over 2% per year, and agency staffing declined an average of over 3%. After the scourge of inflation was cured with a deep recession in 1982, the Reagan economic program of regulatory relief, sound monetary policy, and tax cuts helped launch the global triumph of market economics over socialism. Worldwide prosperity resulted that over the next 25 years produced the greatest reduction in poverty in history. Boyden knows that market economies are superior to socialism, that markets need rules of the road, but those regulations too often benefit the regulated rather than the people they should help. Now, a specific example on which we worked when I worked for Boyden involved Americans with disabilities. Boyden connected with the late Hal Krentz, then working in the White House. Hal was born without sight, which did not deter his remarkable life. He was a graduate of Harvard, a partner in a DC law firm, and the role model for the movie Butterflies Are Free, starring Goldie Hawn. Hal believed strongly in reducing barriers to those with disabilities, but also that it was important that benefits and cost of regulations both be considered. Now, working with Hal and then Boyden and I and others, we took many sensible steps to reduce the barriers while making regulations effective without necessary costs. The vice president and Boyden gained knowledge that helped them both in governing and in campaigning. Now, Boyden also knew when we needed a light moment. After a particularly tough day, he suggested that Hal recount, and this is a true story, believe it or not, that Hal recount the effects of an underage drinking party. It seems that Hal and 3 classmates left together in a Volkswagen Beetle when the driver managed to park the car on someone's lawn. Unable to extricate themselves and hearing police sirens, Hal quickly moved behind the wheel. When the police officer, obviously recognizing that Hal could not see, said, "What in the world is going on?" Hal responded, "I'm the only one who wasn't drinking." As Boyden thought it would, that story had its attendant effect on the listeners. Boyden showed his skill in that moment, as in so many others in his great career. Yet, there are no final victories, a point Boyden understands and one reason why we are here today. The C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Regulatory State ensures that so much of this important work will continue. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great personal pride and pleasure that I give you C. Boyden Gray.
President Cabrera and Dean Butler, this is really something you put on. It's a gathering of a lot of people who are great friends of mine and who have really put in a lot of effort. As my father would have said if he were alive, gee whiz, son, you are really stepping out. Or as Justice Thomas has said as we met upstairs, you finally got your name on something. But seriously, Justice Thomas, I just want to say that I was going to tell the hour story, but you got to it first, since it's your story. But you are, other than my daughter, the best person I ever contributed to. So just please understand that. It's the best thing I ever did in public service, for sure. And thank you for those 3 great dissents, which I think are sort of a roadmap for this center. And without your scholarship in this, I'm not sure we would be on the road to maybe trying to solve this problem. I don't know who else to, I mean, Judge Ginsburg, is married to my former sister-in-law, and once a sister-in-law, I think D.C. always a sister-in-law, which makes Doug my brother-in-law. So, I've always treasured that. And Judge Santel, I mean, we had a lot of fun back in those days. And then I did a foreword for a book that he wrote called Judge Dave and the Rainbow Children or something. I mean, Rainbow People. Boy, if you want to read something funny, go Google that story about Judge Ginsburg, Judge Santel and the Rainbow People. That was a hoot. It's a good thing. Not too many people know about it because I'm not so sure you ever would have been promoted to the D.C. Circuit if it. But
we didn't release it till after I was on there.
No, that's right. That's right. So, Adam, I mean, you thought you had gotten away from me, but not completely. Not completely. So, Tim, I don't know what. We had a lot of fun. I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned Frank Blake because it was really one of the best. Where are you? One of the best fun times of my life. There's one anecdote I want to tell. Sort of, it's not perhaps really fair because Justice Scalia is not alive, but you may remember this, Tim. Our boss, Jim Miller, insisted as we were drafting this executive order, which Naomi now runs, on having Professor Scalia then at Chicago review it. And because he didn't, I don't know whether, he wasn't a lawyer, and I'm not sure he trusted me, and I'm not frankly sure he trusted either you or Frank. And he said, I got to have Nino look at this. And so Nino looked at it, calls me up and says, Boyden, he says, the language is too strong. It's going to be thrown out by the courts. The language is too strong. You got to water it down. Well, I didn't want to do that. My recollection is that Tim said, don't pay any attention to what Jim Miller asked you to do. And so I went ahead, and we went ahead with it anyway, and guess what? It's never been struck down. So anyway, I think Nino always looked at me kind of funny, Now, the height, is a North Carolina connection. Some of you know this story, and probably shouldn't tell it, but I did have an ancestor where my height comes from, who was a congressman around the time of the Civil War. He was 6'8", which was very tall for those days, and he, among other things, thought dueling was a really barbaric custom, and so he ridiculed it to death in the state of North Carolina, which spread beyond those shores, but when he was in Congress, he got challenged to a duel by the family lore is that it was Douglas at the Lincoln Douglas debates, who was very short, but I don't think it was Douglas. But it was a short, cocky congressman who gave my ancestor, for whom my brother was named, Francis Burton Craig was his name, gave him choice of both weapon and place. And my 6'8" ancestor said, okay, if that's what you want, broadswords in the middle of the Potomac. Now, I admire his view of the barbaric nature of dueling, but sometimes in these days I think we could benefit from bringing it back. So what is the purpose of the center? Well, the purpose of the center is to try to, crack this code, Naomi. It's just, by the way, Naomi, I'm told, I'm not going to presume anything, but I'm told that she wanted to speak, but the ethics goons said, no, you can't. And believe me, Naomi, that didn't come from my tenure in the White House Counsel. This is really weird. And if you want an example of the deep state that you're trying to attack, that's Exhibit A. That is Exhibit A. So how do we get inside this thing? How do we crack this code? What silver bullet, what magic bullet, what special sauce, what recipe? And it reminded me, as I was thinking about what to say, that I feel like that what we're looking for is what this Russian oligarch, thinking of Russia and oligarchs, wanted for himself when he refurbished the house that I ended up living in Brussels when I was there. He was in such bad trouble in the Soviet Union with all of his bad deeds that he worried for his life and thought he'd come live out his life in Brussels. And so he had my house, my residence, outfitted with the most glorious and high-level equipment to deter invasion. And it was impregnable. It was high secured. I was told it was the best secured residence in the entire State Department system. And the key to this protection, which made it impregnable, I was told, I was advised, were these very thick 6-inch doors protecting my bedroom. And they were described to me by my local Flemish security officers as 4th century doors. Now, some of you have heard this story. 4th century doors, I said, I bet you all wonder what a 4th century door is, and I did too, and it took me 2 full briefings to screw up enough courage to admit that I didn't know what a 4th century door was or what its significance was, and I was told that a 4th century door is that door which for 1/2 hour to allow you to call the police if you're under attack from Al-Qaeda can withstand anything that could have been thrown at it in the 4th century. So you have visions of battering rams and flaming arrows and boiling oil, and I would say to myself, why not 3rd century, 4th or 5th century? Maybe why not the 21st century? I didn't really understand. But I tell this story because I had to give a lot of really boring after-dinner speeches, and people laughed, as you have, and that was enough. That was enough for, because I didn't want to keep people any more now than I did then from, drinks. So it was allowed me to get out pretty quick. One day my PR guy came to me and said, Mr. Ambassador, you must stop talking about 4th century doors. And I said, why? He said, because you're going to heap disgrace upon you and upon your mission and upon your country. And I said, how so? He said, because there's no such thing as a 4th century door. And I said, I've been briefed twice that there is such a thing. He said, your briefers are wrong. I said, what do I have? And he said, what you have is not a 4th century door, but a forced entry door. So, Naomi, whether it's 4th century or forced entry, we're going to crack this code but with a battering ram or a flaming arrow. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for
That was awesome. Boyden, You know, we have around the law school a lot of our motto, learn, challenge, lead. I want you to know that we take your gift as a challenge to push hard to achieve the goals of the center, a challenge to live up to your name. And it's a very important commitment of ours, and I like you kind of really laying down the gauntlet for us to make us move forward. Naomi, you'll be back one of these days. Heck, I didn't introduce Naomi at the start because I thought I was breaking the rules, and then the president comes up and does it right away. So, you know, it's a free-for-all after that. Okay, so it's time to head to the reception. It's going to be over in the law school in the atrium. And before we do that, we got to do this one more time. You ready?
Yep.
Give me a B. B. Give me an O. O. Give me a Y. Y. Give me a D. D. Give me an E. E. Give me an N. N. What's that spell? Boyden. What's that spell? Boyden. What's that spell? Boyden. Let's go drink. Onward and upward.